stalwart soldiers promoting the Nazi ideology, let's say, and were engaged in behavior that was so atrocious that you can't even read about it without being traumatized. Why are people so committed to their beliefs? Well, to answer that question, you have to investigate what a belief is. And you might think, well, belief is the acceptance of a set of facts about the world, but that's pretty shallow analysis of belief. It's a little bit right, but it's wrong a lot. And it also begs the question, if it's just a matter of a description of a set of facts in the world, well, why are you so emotionally attached to it? There's a hint in the Exodus story. It's a good hint. So, in the Exodus story, whatever God is represented as an animating spirit, as a spirit that calls to you. And to understand that, you have to think about what it means to have a spirit call to you. You have to think about that in a manner that makes it make sense to you. Maybe you have an idea that strikes you. And then that's an interesting phenomenon, right? Because where'd the idea come from? And you think, well, I thought it up. It's like, that's a pretty shallow explanation, because I don't know what that means. It's not a causal explanation. You ask yourself a question, you get an answer. Maybe you find the answer compelling. Where does the answer come from? And why is it compelling? That's a spirit. It's this technical definition. It's a spirit that calls to you. And in Exodus, God, who's the subject of the story, or a subject in the story, a character in the story, is represented as the spirit that calls to those who are enslaved to move towards freedom. And also, God is portrayed as the spirit that calls to the tyrant to free those who are enslaved, and also who punishes tyrants for not doing so. And people ask themselves questions like the question, ask themselves this question, do you believe in God? And they ask that question as if they understand what it means, if they know what it means, but they don't, because belief is a very tricky thing. And one of the complicating factors in relationship to belief you could consider in regard to this story. Do you believe that there's a spirit that calls to people who are enslaved to be free? Or not? And do you believe that there's a spirit that calls out a tyrant for his misbehavior? And maybe the answer to that might be no, but it's at least a good way of formulating the question. Now, most people don't answer no to that question, and that's, especially in the West, that's really independent of whether they regard themselves as atheistic or as a believer, because virtually everybody in the West accepts axiomatically, for example, that slavery is wrong. And so that means they axiomatically accept the idea that a spirit calls to those who are enslaved to be free, and also holds the tyrant responsible. And then to believe in that spirit is to follow its call. That's a good way of thinking about it. So that's worth thinking about, for a very long time. Because you might think, well, that's your idea that slavery is wrong. It's like, no, it's not. If it was your idea, you'd have it, no one else would. But everyone has it. So, in fact, everyone doesn't have it. It has everyone. And Carl Jung, the great Swiss psychoanalyst, said, people don't have ideas. Ideas have people. And that's worth thinking about for 20 years as well. So then you ask, what ideas have you? And if you believe that slavery is wrong, then an idea has you. It's an animating idea too. It's not just it's not just a set of descriptions about the world. By animating idea, I mean it propels you to do something and to perceive something. Maybe it compels you to intervene on behalf of the unfairly oppressed, let's say. Or at least it compels you to feel that you should do that, or it compels you in a manner that makes your conscience bother you if you don't do that. It's associated with motivation and action and perception, and not merely with the world as a set of facts. Back to the first question. Why do people cling to their beliefs? Well, God makes himself manifest to Moses and impels him, in some sense, despite his will, to stand against the Pharaoh, so against tyranny, and to invite the Israelites out of their slavery. And so they do that. They leave the tyranny. But what happens then? Well, in principle, they're going out of the tyranny to the promised land. So what does that mean, psychologically speaking? It means generally when you're going away from a bad place, you're trying to get to somewhere better. And that's why you can think of Exodus in some real sense as a universal narrative, because I don't care what you're doing unless you're aiming down. You're trying to get from wherever you are, which isn't good enough, to somewhere better. That's the basic framework within which we live. It's certainly the framework within which we experience our emotions, because we know, technically speaking, that positive emotion, the positive emotion that fills you with enthusiasm, which is to be filled, by the way, with the Spirit of God, because that's what entheos means. So that's what enthusiasm means. You experience positive emotion in relationship to a goal. And so when people say they want to be happy, which is a complicated thing to say, one of the things they mean is, I want to feel as if I'm progressing towards something positive. And part of that is I want to feel that my life has meaning, because one of the meanings that life can have, when it's meaningful, is the meaning that you experience when you're moving towards somewhere better. Now, you have to believe that there's somewhere better, and you have to believe that you're in fact moving in that direction. But if those preconditions are established, then you feel positive emotion, and that fills you with hope and curiosity, and it engages you. It makes you feel like it's part of what makes you feel like life is worth living. And so you might ask, well, is the Exodus story true? And that's a very complicated question as well, because it begs another question, which is, well, what do you mean by true? And it's true in the sense that, and this may not be the only sense in which it's true, but it's true in the sense that you're always moving from a state that's not so good to one that's better, if you're moving at all. And then you might say, well, what does that have to do with tyranny? And that's worth asking yourself. It's like, how much of your current suffering is a consequence of the tyrannical grip that you even have on yourself, right? You have foolish, counterproductive ideas that you know to be wrong, that you insist are right, that you impose on yourself to your own detriment, and you're unwilling to let them go. That's why pride comes before a fall. That's why the Pharaoh in the story of Exodus doubles down when the plagues come. It's like, how many bloody times do you have to make the same mistake before you learn? And the answer is generally more times than you care to admit. And so, well, then we're back to the initial question. Why cling to your beliefs like that? Even if you know they're tyrannical, even if you know you're tyrannizing yourself. And the answer is, well, you don't move from the tyranny to the promised land. You move from the tyranny to the desert. And that's because when your cherished, self-tyrannizing preconceptions fall apart, or even if you let them go, then you're lost. And it isn't at all obvious that being lost in the desert is better than being under the thumb of the tyrant. In the desert, you don't know which way's up. You don't know which way you're going. It's confusing and unproductive. There's no water there. There's no nourishment there. That's despair, right? That's nihilism. That's trauma. That's a place where you're enticed into the worship of false idols, because you lose the ability to abide by even the spirit that might call you out of tyranny. You know, it's commonly the case that in the real world, let's say, that people who've lived through the collapse of an actual tyranny, let's say, who lived through the collapse of the Soviet Union, suffer intense nostalgia for the tyranny. Things were better then. At least we all had enough to eat. At least we were all taken care of. It's like, you know, well, so we have nostalgia for Stalin. You might think, well, why would people have nostalgia for Stalin? It's like, well, the post-Stalin desert was no improvement over Stalin. Well, maybe it was an improvement because it's an intermediary step, right? If you're going to the promised land, you have to go through the desert first. And, well, that's worth knowing, you know. Why are you stubborn? Why do you cling so desperately to what you already know, but also know to be insufficient? The answer is, well, you want to be lost in the desert? And then the story is quite pessimistic in some sense, because, and this is a strange twist in the story, the Israelites are lost in the desert for 40 years, 3 generations. It's not a very big desert. And then you might say, well, why is it 3 generations? And the answer is, well, maybe once a people is enslaved, it takes 3 generations for them to recover, even once the tyranny collapses. And that's an indication of just how severe the desert really is. So, in any case, I sat with these scholars for 8 days, I believe. 2 hours a day, we walked through the text. We only got halfway through it. We're going to finish it in January. I've got some more people who are going to participate. Ben Shapiro didn't participate the first time, but he's going to the second time, so I'm pretty excited about that. So I can generate more ideas per minute than anybody I've ever met, I think. And so we sat for 16 hours and walked through the story. We stopped just as the 10 Commandments made their appearance on the scene. And we're going to release that on the Dayware Plus platform on November 25th. And so all of us now in the world are looking for an Exodus. So Exodus means ex hodos. That's from the Greek, and it means the pathway forward. And so the story of Exodus is a mythological representation of the eternal pathway forward from tyranny through the desert into the promised land. And that's actually a description, in some real sense, that's a description of all of the transformations that you will undertake in your life. They all have the same pattern, and that's the pattern. This is a story about that pattern, and in the seminar we analyzed the pattern and fleshed it out and tried to attend to all the details. And I learned a lot. I mean, I just barely touched the surface of what we discussed. You know, I think that what I just told you is useful, not because I'm not telling you that because I told you that. I'm telling you that because when I realized, when the ideas that I just shared with you struck me, they illuminated all sorts of things for me. And when I sat in this seminar with all these scholars and we walked through the story, the lights were just going on all over. You know, I knew the Exodus story pretty well, and there was lots of it that I'd already understood, although you can understand a deep story sort of endlessly. But there were parts of the story I didn't understand at all. They just were opaque to me, and much of that was clarified by this seminar. So that's coming out near the end of November. And we're going to get together in January and finish it. And I'm hoping next year, as a consequence of that, perhaps in June, we'll see, because June's a long way away, then I'll be able to do a public lecture series on Exodus, integrating what I learned from the seminar, and doing the same thing that I did with the Genesis series, and make that broadly publicly available. That's the plan. But in the meantime, it's a killer seminar. And you'll learn things that will, I think, if you like the sort of things that you've learned from my lectures, let's say, and podcasts, then you'll find what we discussed in the Exodus seminar extremely useful and expand and broadening in a real fundamental sense. And so one of the things, for example, I can't explain this. I won't explain this. It would take too much time. One of the things I learned, for example, is, and this is something everybody, you really need to know this. You can't live without knowing this. Not without hazard. One of the things you might ask yourself is, if you're in the desert, what should guide you? And this is a key question, because the question is something like, well, imagine that you're lost. And you know what that means. Everyone's lost. Everyone gets lost at some point in their life. And some people appear permanently lost. And so the question of, well, and even if you're not lost now, there may come a time when things fall apart around you, and then you're going to be lost. And then the one thing you're really going to want to know is, what is it that you can rely on to guide you when you're lost? And if you know that, then you're never really lost. Even if things fall apart around you, even if it's your own tyrannical presuppositions that fall apart, and that you leave yourself in the desert, if you know what should guide you there, then suffering you might be, but at least you know the way forward. And if you're suffering and you know the way forward, that's pretty good medication for the suffering. And so one of the things I did learn, and a lot of that came from Jonathan Pajot, who I mentioned earlier, was how to understand what makes itself manifest when you're lost that can guide you reliably forward. And that's worth knowing. And it was a real revelation to me. We put some things together that I knew of separately but hadn't seen stacked on top of each other, and it was unbelievably useful. And so, with the Daily Wire Plus people, I've been able to do these things. They set up the seminar and invited people to Miami and ran the production and did the editing. So that's pretty good. I've also got some documentaries coming out with them very soon. One of them is a documentary I did in Washington at the Museum of the Bible, which is the sort of place that might fill you with skepticism. I didn't know what to expect when I was invited there, but it's really a great place. It's a high-end establishment devoted to detailing the impact of the technology of the book. And we have a documentary called Logos and Literacy coming out very soon. I walked through the history of the book with a number of scholars in Washington, and that turned out very nicely. We have a documentary coming out. I did one with Jonathan Pajot on the Via Dolorosa. That's the pathway of the Passion story, Stations of the Cross in Jerusalem. And I talked to a variety of people about what that story means. And I did a documentary with Ben Shapiro about the city of David. And I went to Athens and did a documentary with a great scholar of Greek thought on the Greek idea of logos, which is the root idea of logic. And you can think of Western civilization as that mixture of the Greek idea of logos, logic, and the Judeo-Christian idea of logos coming together and forming the metaphysical foundation of Western society. And so we have documentaries in Venice and Rome planned. And so all of that's going to be rolling out in the next few months and more. Seminar or special on vision, special on mental health. These are all things that I've been able to do with the Daily Wire Plus team. And so that's exciting. And I learned a lot from it. And now you can learn about it too. And so that seems like a good deal for everybody. If you're interested in such things, and apparently you are, because here you are, after all. And so with that, I'll turn my attention to the questions that you provided. So thank you very much. People who live together and then get married are more likely to get divorced, not less likely. And that's a really interesting fact because it flies in the face of what you might think of as a kind of pragmatic common sense, because you might think, well, you don't buy a car without taking it out for a test drive. Right, and everyone laughs because that seems obvious, but then, woman's not a car. And neither is a man, and really, seriously, really not an object. And so it isn't obvious at all that metaphor applies, even though it's to live together rather than to get married, and that's possible. It's very difficult to separate those two things out, but in some sense it doesn't matter. What the facts reveal is that if the goal is to learn what you need to learn so that you can decide who you should marry more effectively, or learn how to act if you do get married more effectively, and the goal is that your marriage will be better and last, then it doesn't work. And that's a strange truth. And then you might ask yourself, well, why? Why doesn't it work? It's also the case, by the way, that the more sexual partners, the larger the number of sexual partners that someone has had before they get married, the more likely they are to get divorced as well. And it's also the case, by the way, this is also interesting. So I spent a lot of time studying criminal behavior in all sorts of different manifestations, some of it on the political front with regard to the behavior of people who committed terrible atrocities in the service of political belief, some of it on the frontier of criminal sadism itself. I spent a lot of time studying the behavior of serial killers and mass torturers and people like that. But I also spent a lot of time as a research scientist looking at what psychiatrists and psychologists know as antisocial behavior. And antisocial behavior is the pattern of behavior that characterizes criminals. And it usually makes itself manifest pretty early in life, perhaps as early as 2 years old, by the way. And once it's established, it's extremely stable. It isn't obvious at all that psychologists or psychiatrists have learned anything about how to remediate antisocial behavior, so criminal behavior, or its precursors in childhood. Once it's there, That especially seems to be the case after about 4 years of age. Once it's there, it's unbelievably stable and resilient to and resistant to change. And it has a lot of different aspects, antisocial behavior. But one of the markers for antisocial behavior, delinquency, childhood conduct disorder, early onset criminality, is early sexual behavior and multiple partners. And so, you can take that for what it's worth. Why is that the case? You could speculate. Someone who's oriented in a criminal direction is more likely to take advantage of someone else for their own gratification. I think that's the basic commonality. I don't know that for sure, because we don't know why these different symptoms of criminality, let's say, link together, apart from the fact that criminals are predators, and the really pathological criminals are predatory parasites, and that's really what defines a psychopath, by the way. A psychopath is a predatory parasite. The archetypal psychopath is a sadistic predatory parasite. So the sadist takes delight in the pain of others, so positive pleasure in the pain of others. The predator uses others to their own advantage, and the parasite takes no responsibility for his or her own existence and manipulates or compels others to serve that goal. And so that's kind of an ugly combination of traits, and one of the core elements of that is early multiple partner promiscuity. And so that's interesting. And that also might explain why more pre-marriage sexual partners increases the probability of divorce, is that it's a marker for the pattern of behavior that is characterized by the exploitation of others and is therefore more likely to be unsustainable over the medium to long run. So that's interesting. Then you can think about it, metaphysically. I thought about this, or philosophically, I thought about what are you telling someone when you live with them? Okay, so I've talked to lots of people. Women who are cohabiting with men are generally not very happy about the fact that the relationship is not moving towards marriage. Now, I think there's a bunch of reasons for that. Women seem to suffer more emotionally as a consequence of sexual activity outside of the committed relationship. You can imagine why that is. Women experience more negative emotion than men on average in general, but also women pay a much higher, sex is much riskier for women than it is for men, obviously. Hopefully I don't have to explain why that is. So women who are cohabiting are often less than happy about that, and the men who I've talked to about that about their partner's displeasure with the current unstable nature of the relationship, often say something like, well, we don't need a piece of paper to indicate our commitment to each other, which sounds all revolutionary and Che Guevara, but which is really a pretty pathetic bit of reasoning. First of all, for someone to say that means they think that what they just said convinces you that all marriage is a piece of paper. And that's a preposterously foolish argument. I mean, at minimum, in the typical marriage ceremony, you make a vow by whatever is holy to you, or at least in front of the state itself, and then in front of your community as you define it, that you're going to make a commitment to someone. And if you think that's nothing, then you're probably the sort of person that the person you asked to marry you should run away from. So that's pretty shallow. And then you might ask, well, why do you need to commit to your partner in front of your community and a higher authority, let's say? And the answer is, well, life is really, really difficult. And you're going to have a rough time with your partner, no matter how much you love them, because the two of you are different. And you're different sexually, and you're different temperamentally. And so you're not going to see eye to eye all the time. And then horribly difficult things are going to come your way. And the complexity of those difficult things is going to tempt you to pull apart. And exactly when pulling apart might be the worst possible thing for you, and maybe you need that vow before your community and God himself, let's say, or at least the state, and the vow that you've made to yourself and your partner, and the vow that you've made publicly to all your friends to keep you together when the going gets rough. And you might say, well, you don't need that. And I would say, well, that's just because the going hasn't got rough enough for you yet, because when it does get that rough, you'll bloody well know that you needed that. That's for sure. And that will definitely happen to you. That will definitely happen to you if you marry someone, because all the things that life can throw at you, and you certainly don't say, well, that's just a piece of paper. What do I need a piece of paper to validate my love? It's like, your love's that great, is it? You're really that much of a saint that this person, you say you love them, and oh man, they're just done. They're in bliss. They're in paradise for the rest of their life. They can just rely. You're never going to waver. Now that you expressed your love, you're just going to be there 100% of the time. You don't need anyone else to help you. You don't need a vow. You don't need any tradition. Your love is so pure and holy that other person, they can just rely on you from that second onward. No hesitation. It's like, yeah, right. That's just complete bloody rubbish. You can't even rely on yourself in relationship to yourself for that. So, okay, so next, what are you telling your partner? Well, as far as I can tell, if you live with someone, here's what you're saying to each other. You're the best I can manage at the moment. And maybe the same applies to me for you. And we both really don't want to take on any more responsibility than necessary. Plus, we both want to have the option of trading up if an opportunity comes along. And so why don't we just make do with this provisional arrangement while we cast our eye out into the broader world and see if we can fish something better in. And, you can say I'm cynical about that, but I don't think I'm cynical about that. Because living together means something like, well, we're not permanently committed, and not permanently committed means, well, we're impermanently committed, and impermanently committed means we're looking for a better commitment, or perhaps to be alone, but forget that, because that's usually not true. Well, what kind of basis is that to have a relationship with someone? How are you going to found a relationship on that? Especially an intimate relationship. How's that going to work? It's like, you'll do for now. I don't think that's a very solid foundation to move forward. To allow you to move forward. And then it's indeterminate too. So, well, if you're just living together, do you have kids? Because that's a commitment, that's for sure, and that's a real commitment, or it better be, and it's going to be inevitably anyways. And so if there's ambiguity about your commitment to each other, there's going to be ambiguity about your plans for children, and that's a huge ambiguity in most relationships, so that's not helpful. That just means neither of you know what the hell you're doing, and that provokes anxiety and uncertainty, and it decreases hope, because hope is experienced in relationship to a goal, and if the goal is ambiguous, maybe we'll have kids and maybe we'll not, well then there's no real hope there. And so that seems to be a pretty decent pathway to misery. So, and then the next issue is, and this is the final one that I'll discuss, is you're not married if you're living together. And so you might say, well, you're practicing being married. It's like, no, you're not. Why? Because it's not something you can simulate. So one of the things I learned from reading Carl Jung thought about marriage as a container, as a container for alchemical transformation, as a container that would produce a heat so intense that the base metal of your psyche could be transformed into something ideal. But it had to be a container that could take heat, because it requires heat to transform. And you might say, well, how much heat does someone as base as you need to transform? And the answer might be, a lot of heat. I need a lot of heat and pressure before I'm going to change, before I'm going to become purified in any real sense. And so what's the heat and pressure? Here's what it is. You don't get to run away. You're stuck with that person. And they're stuck with you. And you made a vow. It's like, uh-oh, I'm stuck with you. Just like I'm stuck with me. And the vow is exactly that, right? In some real sense. The vow is, I'm going to treat you like you're me. And you don't even like yourself very much, so that's a vicious vow. And so you might say, well, how desperate do you have to be when confronted by someone else to change your ways? And the answer might be, well, you have to be as desperate as being shackled to someone makes you. You know, one of the reasons that Tammy and I have gone along and are still together is because we both know that we're stuck with each other. And so we decided quite a long time ago that we didn't want to have the same stupid fight every day for the next 40 years. And that's like the definition of a bad marriage. It's like we having the same fight every day for 40 years. That's hell. And so the alternative is, now let's just have a bloody fight right here and now and see if we can sort out whatever the hell is so stupid about us that's keeping us in this dismal hell. And why? Well, because otherwise we're just stuck with this misery. And if you can walk away and if you can leave, which you can if you're not bound together, then you're not going to withstand the horrible process of heat and pressure that's required to make you transform. You'll just walk around that. You'll just look for an excuse. People look for an excuse not to do that anyways. And so part of the reason you get married is so you're desperate enough to change. And maybe that doesn't even work. So those are the reasons. Those are the reasons that... No, there's one more. This is the next thing. It's a necessary act of faith. In our culture, because we're not very wise, we think that faith means, especially when it's parodied as religious faith, we think faith means the willingness to suspend disbelief while swallowing a proposition that any fool would reject. That's often how the rationalist atheists view religious claims. Faith means the suspension of your rationality and the acceptance of an absurd claim. That isn't what faith means. Not really. Faith is what makes movement into the unknown possible. And you need to move into the unknown because that's where you're moving. And because the unknown is unknown, because the future is unknown, you cannot step forward into the unknown without faith. It wouldn't be unknown if you knew it. If you knew it, it wouldn't require faith, but you don't know it. And so you step forward into the unknown future as a consequence of your faith in some principles. And if you love someone, if you fall in love with someone and you decide to marry them, you don't have the evidence at hand that that's the right person for you. What you have instead is the joint decision that come hell or high water, you're going to struggle forward together. And then you don't even know if that's the right decision. Because you're not going to know till you've been married your whole life. You're not going to have the data. And so you do have to throw yourself into the abyss to be married. Just like you have to throw yourself into the abyss to be alive. You have to move forward in faith. And then you might say, well, how do you call the best out of yourself and out of your partner, that may be a partner that you're fortunate enough to love? And the answer might be by offering them the gift of faith. And by saying, look, flawed as we both are, if we commit to each other, we have the possibility of becoming more than we are. And I'd like to do that with you, even though there's no evidence that it's going to work. But then you might think too, the more deeply you're committed to that faith, the more likely it is to work. And you can't find out what that commitment is without the commitment, and so you can't simulate it by living together. Because it's not real. It's not real until you make the commitment. And then I would also say, well, what if you don't make the commitment? Well, then you're not committed. And you might say, well, why should I be committed? Well, what's the alternative? It's to be uncommitted. Well, are you free then? Or are you just aimless and hopeless and confused? And you admire people who are committed to something. You sort of wish yourself, when you're feeling aimless and you feel that your life is meaningless, you might think, well, I really wish I was committed to something. Wouldn't it be nice to be committed to something? It's like, well, commit to something then. And you say, well, I don't have the evidence. It's like, you don't commit because of the evidence. You commit because of faith. And there's foolish faith, there's naive faith, and there's blind faith. And I'm not talking about any of that. I'm talking about staking your life on something that might work. If God was willing, if the faith smiled on you, and you put your whole soul into it. And that's what you do. When you're bound, stay faithful. And you can't simulate. It doesn't work. So there's like 5 reasons why it doesn't work. And me, I don't know if you find those reasons compelling or not, but I've thought about it tonight. Maybe there's a part of me that wishes that isn't how life was, and that you could just have a casual relationship with somebody and then trade them in on someone better if they happen to come along. But I just don't believe that's delusion at best. And it's like Machiavellian, psychopathic and narcissistic, and criminal at worst. And so
New Zealand government has established / funded a group called the Disinformation Project. It's well liked, I can tell, to debunk internet myths. Internet myths, yeah. Does this threaten free speech, in your view?
Well, that's its purpose. So yes. It's such a funny term, disinformation. It's really got this Orwellian flavor. It's like, what do you mean disinformation? Do you mean lies? Like, why don't we just use the little Anglo-Saxon word instead of the long, tedious, and manipulative Orwellian word? That's disinformation. It's like, who says? There's the rub. It's like, who's the arbiter of disinformation? I know the answer to that. That's easy. Exactly the person that you don't want to be. So, I mean, it would be lovely. It would be lovely, wouldn't it, if we could just set up a committee of, like, factual people. Just the facts, ma'am. Here's 10 of us. We know the facts. Here's something that's not the facts. Let's put an X on that. Stamp. Disinformation. It's like, who thinks that? How daft do you have to be to believe that's the case? You know, if everybody knows it's a fact, then we don't have to worry about disinformation because everybody knows it's a fact. Imagine there's some dispute about some facts. Well, then not everybody knows the facts. Well, then how do you know who it is that knows the facts? And the answer is, you don't. That's why everyone doesn't know the facts. And so, the facts are revealed as a consequence of, let's say, dialogue. And how about fractious and offensive dialogue, often difficult dialogue? It's like, well, I don't like your difficulty. I don't like the difficulty I don't like your difficulty. Disinformation. It's no longer allowed. It's like, well, that's so, I just can't even believe we're having this discussion, that we have patterns of disinformation. And it really means something like, how do we set up an organization to punish those who dare challenge our ideology and then mask our intent to do that by pretending that we're only motivated by love of the facts? So we can think about this technically for a minute, and it's worthwhile thinking about it. So you might think you have the right to free speech, and it's one of a bunch of rights, list of rights, and you could argue about what those rights are. And the list differs from country to country, even in the West. There's some core rights. There's a core list of rights, let's say. And you might think, well, free speech, that's just one of those rights. And then you might also debate whether those rights are intrinsic, whatever in the world that means, or they're granted to you by the government, by the social contract. It's a very dismal way to think, by the way, but you can make a decent case for both of those positions, intrinsic rights and rights granted to you by the social contract. And then free speech is the right to say whatever comes to mind. And why do you have that right? Well, for the same reason that maybe you have the right to pursue happiness. It's kind of a right of hedonism. You can say, because you're free, you can just say whatever pops into your mind. And you have that right. But that's so shallow, that analysis, so blind. It's so primitive, it's so immature that it's a miracle of confusion. And that's for people who accept that there is a right to free speech. Some people don't even like the idea that there's a right to free speech, and that's a whole other kind of hell. But even among those who think there is a right to free speech, they often think about it in that sort of casual way. And it's not the case. So, I don't know if you know this, but you think in words. Now, some of you also think in images, and some of you do both. And everyone thinks in images and words to some degree, because we all dream. And so then you might think, well, what does it mean that you think in words? And the answer is to be found in an analysis of thought itself. So then you might ask yourself, what are you doing when you're thinking? Let's say you have a problem. And so you're thinking, well, I have a problem. Should I find a new job? So now you're thinking about that. And then you think, well, here's a bunch of reasons why I should have a new job, should find a new job, and a bunch of reasons why I shouldn't. And then you might think, here's some jobs that I could find, job A, job B, and then you compare and contrast those different ideas. But then you might ask, well, what are you doing when you're comparing and contrasting those ideas? Really what you're doing technically is you're setting up motivated sub-personalities in the theater of your imagination, and each of those sub-personalities has a viewpoint, and so its personality has a viewpoint, and it has an argument. And then you listen to one of those sub-personalities argue, here's why I should have a different job, and then you listen to another sub-personality argue, here's why you should stay in the damn job you have, and you let those sub-personalities have a discussion in the theater of your imagination, and you draw your conclusion and then move forward. If you can do that. If you actually think, that's hard. You might just do it on impulse. You might get so angry at work one day that you just tell your boss to go to hell and you quit. Which is not a very good, that's not a very good strategy. It might be necessary, but it's not a very good strategy. It's probably better to think about it first, and then to think, you divide yourself into opposing avatars, and you let those avatars have a discussion. And so what you're doing when you're thinking is mimicking the process of dialogue. And maybe it's not just dialogue, maybe you've got 4 different avatars of your imagination running at the same time, and you're having a pretty good internal debate between all 4. And you're mimicking internally exactly what you would be doing if you sat down and talked to, let's say, a friend or your wife or your husband about the problem. And then you might say, well, what are you doing when you're talking to your wife or your husband or your friend about your problem? And the answer is, you're trying to think. And then you might say, well, why bother thinking? Alfred North Whitehead said, we think so our thoughts can die instead of us. And then you think, what is that? And this is technically true. This is biologically true. This is what human beings do, is we produce fictional variants of ourselves, and then we assess their viability, and then if they're not viable, we kill them. And if they are viable, then we act them out. And if they're viable and we act them out, then we don't die. And so the reason you think is so that you don't fall into a pit. And your thought is dependent on dialogue. Dialogue. Logos, dialogue. Dia means 2, let's say. 2. Logos. That's the divine word. It's the divine word manifesting itself in the interaction between 2 or more people, even internally. Because thought's just the internalization of that. And so, thought is what allows you to generate new variants of yourself that aren't destined for catastrophic failure. And so then what happens if you interfere with free speech? Well, then people can't think. Well, then what happens? Well, then they die instead of their thoughts. And so that's just not just another right. That's the process by which adaptation itself makes itself manifest. And so then you have people who say, well, we can't have any disinformation, which means I don't want anybody telling me anything I'm ever uncomfortable with. It's like, well, so much for thinking. It's like, think about when you think. So when do you think? Well, when you have a problem. Well, what does it mean to have a problem? It means something is in front of you that's an obstacle that you better deal with before it runs you over, let's say. And so you're going to think when you're desperate, and you're desperate when the stakes are high. And then thinking is really difficult. It's really challenging. It's going to result in the death of some of your presuppositions. We already explained what that means. Your tyrannical presuppositions are going to be killed by thought. You're going to be in the desert. And so if someone opposes your thought, maybe they're right. They oppose your thought. And they're right. It's like your thought dies. Maybe you don't. Your thought dies into the desert with you. That's not very pleasant. Well, it's no wonder people want to interfere with that. But if you don't allow people to speak freely, it isn't allowed. Because the government doesn't allow that. Governments that don't allow that precipitously collapse. Or they transform themselves into tyrannies, and then they precipitously collapse. This isn't optional. And so, if you don't allow for free speech, if you don't promote free speech, if you don't understand the transcendent value of free speech, then you deny people the opportunity to think, and then they die. And so, I don't care why people justify their interference with that. I don't care what the rationale is. It's like the people who don't want you to think, they are not only your enemy, they are the enemies of themselves.
Should we be worried about the WEF and our own government push to disseminate our farming, even though we're one of the leaders in climate neutral production?
Should you be worried about the WEF? I suppose to some degree it depends on what else you have to be worried about. Because one of the things you might ask yourself is, are you worrying about the WEF because there's other things you should be worrying about that you don't want to think about? And that's what often happens to people, they get their heads in the clouds about some abstract political issue because there's all sorts of tyranny and hell in their house that they don't want to face. And so they bury themselves in the news instead of cleaning their room, let's say. And so you got to watch that. You got to watch that tendency on your part to replace the personal with the political. But it's also the case that attention to the political has its place. I'm not a fan of the WEF. I'm not a fan of globalist utopians. I think they're pretentious and ignorant beyond comprehension. I don't like central planners. I don't think central planning works. And I particularly don't like central planners who deny local sovereignty. And that might be the sovereignty of the individual or the sovereignty of the province or the state or the country. Better to have decentralized power. Better to have responsibility distributed down the hierarchy all the way to the individual. And I don't trust people who don't know that. I was noticing the other day, this really, to be vulgar, pissed me off. I was on an airplane flying here, and I looked up some additional flights because my flight got delayed. And I looked up the flights on Google from Dallas to Auckland. And when the flights came up, all the flights were listed with their carbon load. And I thought, you pricks. How dare you sell me something, airline ticket, and moralize at me at the same time. It's like, you're airlines, right? Yeah. You run planes? Yeah. Do they produce carbon? Yeah. Are you selling the tickets? Yes. But we want to make you feel guilty about the carbon. No, thank you. Thank you very much. And all I see in that is, well, what's the next thing? Well, the next thing obviously is, there's already a bank in Australia announced this 2 weeks ago. This is what they're offering you. You want to save the planet? We'll send you a report every month that details out the carbon load of all your purchases. It's like, oh good, you're going to track what I buy, and you're going to associate each of those purchases with planetary scale damage. And you don't think that's going to go wrong. Because what's the next step? It's like, well, that's easy. So we hierarchically rank your purchases by degree of hypothetical planetary damage, and we tax you on that basis. Or maybe we just decide, why the hell do you need to fly anyways? Why are you so important? Why does your concern, your petty business concern, trump the health of the planet? Why should you be allowed to fly at all? I mean, it's a bloody miracle, right? It's a miracle. And if you don't know this, you're not thinking. You free people in a country like New Zealand, you can just hop on a jet. I mean, I know you have to be able to afford the ticket, but if you can afford the ticket, you can just hop on a jet and you can go anywhere. And you can buy a car. You can buy a car. Think of that. And then you just drive somewhere you want to drive. And no one can tell you not to. Yet. And that's a miracle. It's like, what makes you so important? What's your stupid business? Who cares about your pizza restaurant? You're dumping carbon into the atmosphere. You don't need to fly. You don't need a car. You might not even need a bicycle. You can just walk. And you should hold your breath. So I see the globalist utopian types, the WEF types, they're all concerned about climate change, and they're not. I talked to Bjorn Lomborg the other day about this. Lomborg, I think, knows more about this than anyone else in the world. He figures all the trillions of dollars that have been spent since 2005 on climate remediation. COP27. Well, we tried this 26 times already and it didn't work at all. So the next thing to do is to try it 27 times. It's like, he figures that all of the climate remediation we've managed so far, according to the UN's own climate model projections, has reduced the temperature of the planet 1/10,000th of a degree. And so the obvious thing to do with that sort of data at hand is to do a bunch more of it more expensively. And that's what your utopian globalists are insisting that you do. And you think, well, they won't come for your car. It's like, oh, not only will they come for your car, they already have. The European Union announced, and so did California, but we'll talk about the European Union, I think it was 2 weeks ago, no internal combustion allowed to be sold in the European Union by, I think it was 2035. It's like, this is utterly insane. But, like I said, you peasants, what makes you think you have a right to a car? And I thought this for years, that there's almost nothing more miraculous that our society's ever produced on the front that unites metaphysics and technology than the automobile. You think how free a country has to be so that some 16-year-old yahoo can buy a 500 horsepower Mustang and race it down the streets. Like, You know how dangerous that is? It's like the most dangerous thing you ever do in your life. And maybe you'll encourage your teenager to do it, because you'd rather be free and living an adventure than be a secure slave. It's like, here's the keys, kid. Try not to die. I think one of the things the West did that undermined the totalitarian state so brutally was to entice them with automobiles. Because there's nothing that screams individual freedom louder than a car, right? Noisy, dangerous, fast, private, free. You export those to a totalitarian country, and the technology itself says, you can do whatever the hell you want, even if it's dangerous. Well, that's the ethos of a courageous people. It's like, well, we can't have that anymore because why? Carbon. Yeah, well, carbon. So, yeah, you hate automobiles, you hate comedians, you're a tyrant. So, yeah, I don't like the WEF. About an article that Deloitte, one of the world's biggest consulting companies, had put out. And they modeled the climate, which they didn't. And then they modeled the economy on top of that, which you can't. And then they projected that out 100 years, and you can't do that. And I don't care how much you think that's mathematics and how much you think it's a model. It's just because there's some numbers in it doesn't make it real. And then their conclusion was, we're all going to have to tighten our belts a fair bit, because otherwise, apocalypse. And I read that and I think, we're all going to have to tighten our belts, are we? All of us, including Deloitte consultants. Because they're the first ones whose belts are going to be tightened. It's like, I know how this works. Anybody with any sense knows how this works. So let's say, well, we tighten our belts and we make energy more expensive. Carbon tax, but not just a carbon tax. Well, we can't have natural gas and we can't have coal and we can't have nuclear. We can have wind and solar, so then we can have way more expensive electricity, or none at all. I don't know what it's gone up in Germany, like a factor of 5, something like that. And it's unreliable, plus they're dependent on the Russians, which turned out to be a very bad idea, in case anyone hasn't noticed yet. So fine, we make energy more expensive. Why? Well, our Deputy Prime Minister in Canada, Chrystia Freeland, about a month and a half ago, oil prices shot way up in Canada, as they have everywhere, because, we hardly have any oil in Canada. We have an oil sands deposit in Alberta that's bigger than Switzerland. It's like, there's no excuse for a shortage of oil in Canada, or anywhere for that matter. Chrystia Freeland said, well, it's a good thing that gasoline is much more expensive in Canada, because then when the ordinary person fills up their automobile, they'll be reminded of just how important climate change really is. It's like, well, thank you very much, Chrystia. It's like, not only are you so goddamn incompetent that your bloody government doubled the price of petrol in Canada, but now you're going to insist that that's actually a moral virtue. And then you might be resistant to this line of argument and think, well, climate change is important. It's like, okay, I don't think so, but okay, we'll allow you that. So what are you going to do about it? We're going to make energy more expensive. Okay, fair enough. More expensive for who? Well, rich people? Well, kind of. Most rich people, they don't care if their heating bill doubles. If they cared if their heating bill doubled, they wouldn't be rich. Who cares if their heating bill doubles? People who are barely clinging to the edge of the world, right? And we live in an economic hierarchy. That's the patriarchy, by the way. And so the lefties know this in principle. Here's the patriarchy. nasty capitalist billionaire scum rat thieves at the top, and then who's stolen everything from everyone, and then at the bottom, all those poor oppressed people who are barely clinging on to the edge of reality. And so, well, let's double the price of energy. Okay, what happens? Well, a bunch of those people who are barely clinging on to the edge of the cliff just fall off. And a whole bunch of them, because they're way more numerous at the bottom, and all you have to do is stress someone barely clinging to the edge of the world a little bit more, and they just let go and fall. And then you might say, and so is that going to help the planet as you make all these poor people who are barely making it worse off because you double their energy costs and their food costs and push them into absolute poverty? And that's going to save the planet, is it? It's going to save the hypothetical poor 100 years from now. But they're actually going to suffer and die, especially in poor countries. That's your theory. And then you might say, well, yeah, that's my theory. Better 100 million people now than a billion people in 100 years. It's like, no, first, but I'll accept your idiot argument for a second. It's like, you're so sure that this billion people that you're hypothetically saving, you're so sure about your model of the world that you're willing to sacrifice 100 million people right now to save that hypothetical billion in 100 years. That's how certain you are of your theories, because these people are actually going to die. Well, the answer to that seems to be yes. We're so certain of it. I'm not so certain about that. And I've seen on the left in particular, despite repeated assurances from the leftists that they care about the poor and oppressed more than anyone else, if push comes to shove, they're perfectly willing to sacrifice the poor to their futuristic utopian delusion of a post-capitalist society. And so, I'm not very happy with people who are willing to sacrifice other people to their utopian delusion. We saw a fair bit of that in the last 100 years already. And I think the WEF types fit very nicely into that category. And so I'm not very fond of them, let's say. And I don't think they have your best interests in mind. You are probably.
How can I help a trans convinced that they are the opposite gender before they make a regrettable mistake? That's an easy one.
It's a hard question to answer because the devil's always in the details. I would always ask, I would always try to specify the situation more, like, who exactly are you talking about? Are you talking about some confused kid? I guess I know how I can address this to some degree. So let's take apart some of the arguments that are relevant to this idea. So imagine you have a child who's 12 or 13 who is suffering from so-called gender dysphoria. Okay, so let's take that apart to begin with. So the first thing we know is that most of those kids now in particular, the dysphoria is more real than the gender dysphoria. And so many people who suffer from psychopathological conditions. Misery of sufficient magnitude to bring them to the attention, let's say, of medical professionals, are suffering from some variation of depression and anxiety. And that's rather undifferentiated. So you might say, well, I'm upset about my body, but I'm depressed and anxious. And then the question is, well, how important is the depression and the anxiety compared to bodily concern? And that the answer from the literature, especially now, given how prevalent this condition of gender dysphoria has become, is that most of the symptomatology is undifferentiated. And so these kids, adolescents, are miserable, and they think they're miserable because they're uncomfortable in their bodies, and they think they're uncomfortable in their bodies because they're the wrong sex. They are miserable. Some of that misery is body focused, and then for a tiny proportion of them, there's a mismatch between their temperament and their biological sex. But most of it is just depression and anxiety. And so that's what should be treated, to the degree that that can be treated, rather than jumping to the conclusion that it's time to bring out the sterilizing hormones and the surgical knives, let's say. And I would say the data on that are pretty much incontrovertible. We first of all know that most of the symptomatology associated with gender dysphoria is non-specific, so it falls into the category of depression and anxiety. And we also know that if you leave kids the hell alone who have gender dysphoria, then by the time they hit 18, 19, 90% of them have settled into acceptance of their biological sex. And one of the prime medical dicta is first do no harm, and we know what the research says. It says what I just said, and so if you have any sense, you just listen and you don't act precipitously. And so what are the objections? Well, this is the horrible situation that the typical parent finds themselves in. So the American Psychological Association has a position paper on gender-affirming care, and I've gone through it in some detail. And one of the claims, it's quite funny, if you have a very dark sense of humor, it's very funny to see this, but on one page of the report they say, well, you know, because of prejudice against trans people, we really don't have any reliable medium to long-term follow-up studies of the mental health of people who transition. Okay, so you can imagine that might be true. Now, and you could even imagine it might be true because of prejudice. Now, it's probably true because there hasn't been that many people who have transitioned, so to speak, another horrible Orwellian term, but I'll use it for now. There hasn't been that many people who transitioned, and that hasn't been happening for very long, so how the hell could we do the studies? But we'll give the devil his due and say it is a matter of prejudice and that the studies don't exist because of that. So we don't know what the long-term consequences are of transitioning, because the whole bloody research enterprise is homophobic or transphobic, whatever phobia is relevant in this situation. I guess it's transphobic, and so we don't do the studies. Then I guess we don't have the studies, do we? That's the conclusion you derive from that. Okay, we don't have the studies. Well, then 3 pages later, we find out that, well, you have to encourage children to transition if they think they need to. That's gender-affirming care. Because if you don't, you increase their suicide risk. And if you do, you decrease their suicide risk. It's like, okay, I thought we didn't have those studies. Like, which is it here, folks? Because it can't be both. We either don't know because of transphobia and the refusal of the patriarchal, oppressive medical establishment to do the studies, Or we do know, which means the studies are there. That's it, unless you're willing to abandon the principle of non-contradiction altogether, and you might be perfectly willing to do that. And so the typical parent is in this situation. It's a horrible situation if you're a parent. So imagine you have a girl, because this is happening way more to girls than to boys, which is exactly, by the way, what I predicted would happen in 2016 when I opposed the compelled speech laws in Canada. I told the Senate straight out, you people will cause a psychogenic epidemic. There's a 300-year research history on psychogenic epidemics: cutting, bulimia, anorexia, multiple personality disorder, satanic ritual abuse accusations. What was the other one? Memories of abuse, that's right, fabricated memories of abuse. These psychological epidemics that swing through the population. Fads, let's say, psychological fads, almost always affect young adolescent women. Well documented. And I thought, well, you're going to confuse confused adolescents about the nature of sex, and then the most confused adolescents will get confused enough by that to fall into desperate confusion, and you'll generate an epidemic. So, no, you're just being paranoid. It's like, yeah, well, have it your way, you bloody blind fools. This is exactly what's going to happen. So, well, here we are, and it's happened. And so, unsurprisingly. So, now you're a parent, and you've got this confused adolescent girl, and 20% of her friends think they're ambisexual or something. And so she doesn't know, and she's feeling pretty miserable. And why? Well, she's feeling miserable because she's an adolescent female. And that's how they feel. And so then you might ask, well, why? And I would say, well, we know why. So boys and girls, before they hit puberty, have about the same level of negative emotion. But as soon as they hit puberty, girls have more negative emotion than boys, on average. Okay, there's exceptions, but on average. And the average matters because if females on average have more negative emotion, that means that a higher proportion of females, there will be a higher proportion of females who have exceptionally high levels of negative emotion. And those will be the ones who are susceptible to depression and anxiety, and then to psychogenic epidemics. And it doesn't take that much difference at the mean to produce huge differences at the extremes. Okay, so girl hits puberty, her levels of negative emotion go up. Why? Well, likely because the world becomes more dangerous for girls when they hit puberty. Well, why? Well, because the boys get bigger than them, so that's a problem. They're not going to be as successful in physical combat. They need to be more afraid of engaging in physical struggle because they're more likely to lose. And then they're also sexually vulnerable. And that's a big problem. It's a huge problem because they become targets of predation, and the consequence of sexual predation for a young woman is catastrophic. She becomes pregnant. I don't have to go into that. You can think that through for yourselves. And so then also, it looks like, arguably, women have higher levels of negative emotion than men because they're primarily responsible for infant care. And if you're going to care for an infant, you need to be alert to danger. And if you're alert to danger, that means you're more sensitive to negative emotion. And so women are more sensitive to negative emotion than men. And that starts at puberty. And once it's instantiated at puberty, it never goes away. And so that's the price that women pay for their reproductive role. They pay that price emotionally. And then you might say, well, how does negative emotion manifest itself in adolescent girls? And the answer is, in large part, in bodily self-consciousness. And so there's a huge literature on that too. So women are much more likely to focus their negative emotion on bodily concerns. Why? Well, how about because they're evaluated more harshly on their appearance? How would that be? Is that a shock to anybody? It shouldn't be. It's obvious. And even if it wasn't obvious, it's well documented. So men are judged by women more harshly on their economic viability and generosity, and women are judged more harshly on their physical appearance. And their physical appearance in relationship to signals of youth, symmetry, and fertility, indicating essentially fecundity. And so that's life, folks. And so that's why girls have more negative emotion than boys, and it's bodily focused. And so they're going to be more self-conscious about their bodies. And then if you take idiot educators who keep telling them that the reason they're self-conscious about their bodies is because they're the wrong sex, then the really confused girls who are also desperately seeking attention and looking at any pathway whatsoever to get it are going to fall for the psychogenic epidemic. And so you need to know all that if you're going to talk to a teenager. And the doctors are going to say, well, you know, if you don't help your child transition, then you're going to increase the risk of suicide. Would you rather have a live child who's a different sex or a dead child? It's a lovely thing to tell parents. It's like, well, of course we'd rather have our live child. Well, then you better get on board with the forced sterilization, folks. It's like, yeah, well, what about the lack of long-term follow-up studies? Oh, well, I thought you'd forgotten about that already. Yeah. And so when some doctor tells you, well, if you don't apply gender-affirming standards to your child, they're going to commit suicide, the right rejoinder is, well, if they have an elevated risk of suicide, it's actually because they're depressed and anxious, not because they have gender dysphoria, because people with higher levels of depression and anxiety than normal have an elevated risk of suicide. Plus, there are no long-term studies indicating that you have one shred of evidence for that claim. And so, how about not the guilt? And so you all need to know that if you're going to fight this battle. There's no evidence that you're putting your child at risk by saying, you know what? You're 13 and you're confused, and we're not going to allow you to make an irrevocable, life-threatening decision involving surgical mutilation and sterilization just because you're confused. And that will make the child more secure. Because imagine they're confused and miserable and self-conscious and unpopular and desperate. It's like, that sucks. Well, here's how to make it worse. Promote ambiguity in their mind about which sex they are. That'll really decrease the confusion. It's like, you think you're not confused already, wait till you don't know which sex you are. Do you think that's going to make you feel better? Like, and then you can tell them too, well, you're so confused about which sex you are that we think you'll probably die from it, suicide. And so we're willing to let ideologically possessed and quasi-psychopathic surgeons experiment on you just so we don't take that risk. Feel better? And the answer from your kid is going to be, no, I was pretty damn terrified when I walked into this office, and I'm a hell of a lot worse now. This is insanity. It's insanity. There isn't a shred of clinical evidence to support this preposterous idea of gender-affirming care. You do not affirm someone's identity if you're a therapist. That is an utterly preposterous claim. If you come to me as a therapist, I'm a therapist, and all we do is investigate your identity. We certainly don't assume that however you happen to feel about who the hell you are right now is the final answer. Why were you even coming to therapy if that's the case? I don't know what your identity should be. Neither do you. Why don't we talk about it for like a year and see if we can straighten it out? And I'm going to have to ask you questions. You're going to have to ask yourself questions. We're going to have to put everything under the microscope. I'm not going to just say, well, like you might say to an anorexic. She comes to you and says, you know, I only weigh 85 pounds and I'm 5'7", but I'm pretty damn convinced I'm too fat. It's like, oh, hey, man, if you're feeling too fat, despite the fact that I can see every rib in your body, you're definitely too fat. I don't understand the difference between that and the subjective identity claim. You know, when someone comes to you who's depressed and they say, look, man, I'm really useless. I'm really useless. I've been useless my whole life. I'm useless now, and as far as I can tell, that's just going to get worse in the future. I'm so useless that I think I should kill myself because it just saved everybody the trouble. Say, hey, that's how you feel, man. For sure, you're that useless. Like, here's a noose. You feel affirmed? You don't do that as a therapist. You subject. And here's another thing. You're bound by, as a therapist, and as a medical professional as well, to use the most accurate current means of diagnosis if someone presents you with a problem. And one diagnostic technique is self-report. So, you know, if you come to me and you list off some depressive symptoms, then I can accept that as one form of evidence. But I don't accept that. Not only do I not accept that as final, I'm actually bound by the ethical standards of my own profession not to accept it as final. I have to undergo a rigorous multidimensional analysis to put forward a proper diagnosis.